The New York Times has now done in the year 2021 what Canada's public broadcasters, what Canada's private sector broadcasters have failed to do for decades. They have made the question of the 20th century's forced assimilation and genocide of Indigenous people matter. There's a detail in the midst of the new podcast the New York Times put out just yesterday that I think will catch many American listeners by surprise, many European listeners by surprise, and so on. Probably many administrators at the United Nations, many people whose whole careers are in the field of human rights law. A lot of those people live in New York City because the United Nations is headquartered in New York City. A lot of them will be caught by surprise when they hear the anecdote of a newborn baby being incinerated in an oven. Oh, well, all of a sudden, this starts to sound like the Holocaust. Well, of course, scenario is much more different than the Holocaust than that description might at first suggest. The oven in question was a furnace used to heat a building. Wasn't a concentration camp. It was a school. You can get into all kinds of details that differentiate the two. However, the New York Times has reported, as never before, that Canada's so-called system of residential schools did involve putting people into ovens. That it did involve putting dead bodies into unmarked graves. That it did involve cutting holes in the ice on the surface of a river to stuff corpses into the water where they would never be seen again. The title of this video is Everybody Knew. And we're going to talk a little bit about what I mean by everybody and what it means to know. When I was a child, I remember my father, frankly, freaked out in response to a news story. Hi, guys. So I am willing to chit-chat with people in the audience, but I do have a lot to say, as you can imagine. So welcome to the show, and thank you for the donation. Anyone has a salient or, frankly, question, I'll be happy enough to get to it in due course. I remember my father freaked out over what was basically a news story about a black and white photograph taken in Germany during the Nazi era. And I forget what the point of the photograph was. It was showing some event or maybe just even a family posing in front of their shop or something. But the photograph captured graffiti in the background. So, graffiti written on a wall of a city somewhere in Germany. And if you zoomed in on the details of graffiti, you could see in German that someone had written that Jews deserve to be put into a particular concentration camp. That was written on the wall. And my father flipped out at this because he said, don't you realize this is evidence that they knew, that the Germans knew, that everybody knew, that whoever wrote this graffiti and whoever was seeing this graffiti going down the street, they knew the significance of the name of that concentration camp. They knew the significance of people being put into the concentration camp and so on. Now, this reflects, my father grew up very much in the post-war era. It reflects the very strange mix of naivete and cynicism he had his whole life. But I remember saying to him, Barry, I did not call him Dad. I called him by his first name. I said, Barry, have you ever sat down and tried to work out an estimate of how many people were employed at these concentration camps and at these extermination camps? And you have to go beyond just the staff who were on site. Like, what about the people who were driving trucks back and forth to them to provide them with food and provisions? You have to kind of work out your estimate a bit for how many people were really involved on a day-to-day basis or on a once per month basis. And have you looked at where the staff lived and where their kids went to school and so on? Like, they weren't completely isolated from the rest of German society. And of course, above and beyond that, you can look at how these issues were actually represented even within the Nazi Party itself. I think it's a gross misconception to imagine that the Holocaust was a secret. It wasn't even a secret in a book written by Adolf Hitler called Mein Kampf. Like, it's just ridiculous to pretend. I mean, how could people at the time have read Mein Kampf and voted for Adolf Hitler and supported this party? And they just really weren't clear on what the plan was with these concentration camps. Like, my father wasn't kidding. I think his whole generation, they grew up with this really sick justification for why we had switched from being such dire enemies of the Germans to suddenly being their allies. Like the alliance with West Germany against East Germany and Russia. It's so rapid. And the convenient excuse was, well, they didn't know. Nobody knew. Like it was a secret. I mean, how, again, just, what I challenge for is, how can you be so naive? And then conversely, if you actually believe this was a secret, like in the same sense that like a CIA operation is top secret, why would this piece of graffiti, put the lie to that? Now, a totally different side of the world, totally different episode, totally different ethical issues involved. I've dealt with that again and again when Americans talk about the bombing of Laos being a secret war. American foreign policy in Laos and Cambodia. It's like, I can show you right now a film clip of Richard Nixon giving a press conference, standing in front of a map of Laos, pointing to it, explaining. Same with Cambodia. Like, I can show you the page in Richard Nixon's autobiography where he's talking about this. How can you possibly perceive something that was openly presented and discussed at White House press conferences, covered in the newspapers and so on? How, and something that was the subject of public protest marches, in New York City, in Washington, and definitely in Ottawa, Canada, definitely in Toronto. I mean, to say we had them too. How can you say this was a secret war? What does that mean? What are we doing ethically, intellectually, or even philosophically in disclaiming that we didn't know? Now this latter issue, this latter example relates back to the first one, the main topic of this video, in a dynamic way. My parents knew all about Vietnam. My parents knew all about Cambodia. My parents knew all about the bombing of Laos. They didn't care about First Nations. Why? So my parents, by the way, my father ethnically white, my mother ethnically Jewish, both of them born and raised in Canada, both of them university educated. Just think about what would have been harder for them to know about, and which issue would it have been harder or easier for them to make a decisive difference in public policy on? Sorry if that's a convoluted sense. Like, really, from where my parents were living in Canada, what difference can they possibly make in the history of Vietnam and the history of Cambodia and the history of Laos, right? What does their opinion matter? What can they do about it? What can they know about? What can they do about the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Mohawk, the Dene, the Inuit, Canada's First Nations people? And then think about also the span of my parents' lives. How many years did they care about Vietnam? Was it 5 years? Was it 10 years? Was it 15 years? I don't know. Maybe it was 5 years. You know what I mean? This issue really mattered to them. The potential for them to make a difference, for just one tribe or for all Indigenous people in Canada, over 50 years, over 70 years, they live long lives, right? And those issues really are decided in Ottawa, to a lesser extent in Toronto, in Montreal, in cities in Canada. The fate of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, right? We have nothing to do with it. My parents could have known about what was happening in Canada's residential schools. They could have known what was happening in our process of forced assimilation and genocide, right? They could have known because I knew. I can really say that. And it was a huge divide between us. They could have known, they could have cared, and they didn't. And why? Shout out to everyone in the audience. Wicked Energy thanks me for my response to Foot Soldier's video. Well, thanks. It's nice to know someone appreciated it. I'm happy to pause every so often and respond to your questions if you guys have anything to say on topic. It's also great if you guys want to hit the thumbs up. We'll have more people join the audience while the broadcast is ongoing. That is really the only difference that it makes. More thumbs up means that basically my video gets advertised more to people who already subscribe to my channel or have already been to my channel anyway. It doesn't advertise it to complete strangers. It's not the reality of how YouTube works in 2021. So the New York Times related an anecdote about a newborn baby being put into an oven and incinerated. It's not the first anecdote of that kind I've heard. This is a practice that happened at First Nations residential schools, Indian schools operated by the government, to my knowledge, again and again. I remember a detailed account which came from one of the women who put the baby in the oven. So she was there as a direct witness at that moment. And she stated that the particular baby she put in the oven was the product of one of the teachers raping one of the students. Now, that's the kind of thing you'd have to live with for quite some time. Presumably the student gets pregnant and she's then on the school campus continually for something like 9 months. You know, like it's not really something that can be hidden in the crowded social context of a school where everyone is sleeping and eating their meals on the same campus. And then one day the baby is born and then the baby disappears. And from the perspective of this particular woman, she knows what happens to the baby because she was in the furnace room when that event transpired. I don't think there ever was an order given out from the government of Canada. And I don't think there was a plan by either the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church where they sent out orders saying, yeah, go ahead, rape the students, and if they get pregnant, incinerate the babies. I don't think so. I think that what you had was a culture that developed amongst the teachers and administrators where certain practices, certain coping methods came to be known, came to be accepted, and came to be shared, whether those were in whispers or conversations or written letters from one campus to the next, from one administrator to the next. The use of chains, the use of metal shackles, the use of whipping in public, the use of forced labor for long hours, the use of starvation, the use of intentional transmission of disease, killing students by locking them in a room where they would die of a contagious disease, where they would contract the contagious disease, perhaps nearly die, but in many cases actually die. The use of eugenic procedures to render students permanently infertile. Okay. All of this has been documented. All of it has been known by people like me who have no inside source information. I'm going to talk about how much I knew as a child in the 1990s in just a moment, but 9 years ago, I was more involved with First Nations politics than I am now. I was studying Cree and Ojibwe at a university that's called First Nations University. Supposedly the best place to do this in Canada. It's an absolutely terrible place to do this. Don't study there. It's a disaster of an institution. But anyway, I was studying the languages and I was involved with and following the politics to a significant extent. And there was this guy, real eccentric, who went out with a dowsing rod to try to find dead bodies on the campus of one of these residential schools. Now, if you don't know what dosing means, I don't blame you. We have several people here for whom English is not their first language. So I will put this in quotation marks. D-O-W-S-I-N-G. This is some ancient English slang. So dosing is, do you know what dosing is? Well, no. Dosing is an old-fashioned kind of, it's an aspect of witchcraft, I suppose, where people would hold a stick, a wooden stick, normally a Y-shaped stick from a tree, and they would close their eyes and walk holding the stick, and they would be able to feel, for example, where water was passing beneath the surface of the earth. So someone in the audience knows this term, dosing. Really, it just depends how much like 17th century literature you've read or something. Yeah, it goes back a few centuries. So dosing was a technique used for different kinds of supernatural cause, shall we say. Now, in this case, they were dosing for dead bodies. So this guy was, and he was, I mean, a genuine advocate for, an activist for First Nations people, but eccentric, goes out with the dowsing rod and a team of people. They walk through one of the orchards that's on the campus of one of these residential schools. Now, the orchard cells are more significant than you might think. Look at the actual schedule these kids were living on, being woken up in the morning and forced to do hard labor. Very often the orchards, so on. That was a big part of their quote-unquote education, was that they were really being starved and worked in this way with forced labor. Anyway, so they're going through the orchard with this dowsing rod, and through whatever preternatural cognition, you know, the person holding the dowsing rod says, there, dig there. They get out the shovel and the spade, they dig through the earth. Lo and behold, there is the body of a child. They tried to make a news story out of this. And aside from very small, very obscure First Nations publications and websites, nobody wanted to carry it. You know, it's not on the NBC News. It's not on CBS. It's not on the BBC. It's not on the CBC. It's not on local Canadian broadcasters. This was, I wouldn't even say it was buried. But at that time, just 9 years ago, any discourse of this kind was not being covered by the mainstream press at all. It was in really obscure political publications that I was following, but almost nobody else was 9 years ago. And I think also just the eccentricity of this guy, this activist, probably freaked out some of the mainstream press. Now, I did not respond to this by becoming a true believer in the magical practice of dowsing. My comment at the time, partly cynical, reflecting the fact that I'm an atheist and a skeptic and so on, and partly just well-informed by my knowledge of historical circumstances, was, have you considered the possibility that if they'd put down the shovel and the spade anywhere in that orchard, they would have found another dead body? We just had the finding of over 200 dead bodies on one of these school campuses. And there is a not so supernatural explanation for the fact that they knew where to dig, because they were told, just in terms of the oral history, they were told by people who lived there and worked there, whereabouts generally the dead bodies were buried. Because again, just like you have a witness to who put the baby in the oven, the kids themselves were doing all this hard labor, right? The priests were lazy. You know, the church leaders at these schools were lazy. They weren't going to dig the grave. They'd force these kids to dig the grave. So there's some memory of where the bodies have been buried. The residential schools, you know, partly have to be remembered for what they did, and they partly have to be remembered for what they failed to do. What they did was, you know, forced assimilation, attempted genocide, murder, rape, torture, genuinely, by the strictest definition. I've read accounts of torture in the most literal sense at these. But what did they fail to do? You know, they utterly failed to provide these First Nations kids with an education that would prepare them to succeed in Canada. I mean, let's be blunt. In white Western 20th century society, or whichever century you want to talk about. And on the contrary, of course, they did also traumatize these kids, but they also just raised them in a deeply dysfunctional situation where they were separated from their own parents and they weren't provided with some kind of loving family to replace those parents. They were raised, in this very, very strange and psychologically damning set of circumstances that explains to a great extent the mass drug addiction, mass gang affiliation, mass antisocial and self-destructive behavior that generation went on to do, even for people who were not victims of rape, or torture or something, being taken away from their family at such a young age and subjected to such extreme and bizarre conditions. They failed to provide an education that any of us would voluntarily enroll our own students in. So I'm going to mention a circumstance now as an imperfect parallel. All comparisons are odious. All parallels are imperfect. We have 31 people in the audience. Guys, if we could get 31 thumbs up, more people will join us. We'll get some more questions to be replied. I make zero money out of this, but if you're here, you can hit the thumbs up. If you change your mind later, you can hit the thumbs down instead. It's fine. Especially in third world countries, it is quite common to have a prison with a kindergarten attached. So women are sent to prison. This happens in wealthy countries also, but it's especially common in third world countries. Women are sent to prison and they're pregnant at the time they happen to get sentenced, or while they're in prison, somehow, one way or another, they manage to get pregnant. Maybe during a visit from their husband or loved one, maybe with one of the prison guards, whatever the situation may be. Pregnancy in prison is a reality in the 21st century. So a lot of these prisons will then set up a kind of kindergarten so that the women are not immediately separated from their children when they're in prison. And you might have another situation. What if a woman is 9 months pregnant at the time she's sentenced to go to prison, or maybe she's just given birth at the time she's sentenced, completes her case. Do you want to separate this child so that it has to be raised by its grandparents or some remote relative? Maybe there are no remote relatives. Maybe this child is going to become a total orphan if you separate from his mother. Or do you want to have some facilities in the prison so that the woman can serve her jail sentence and the child can go to kindergarten, or the child can go to school? Okay. What happens if the prison guards are sending their children to a separate kindergarten, to a separate school? And what happens if you pass a law, if you pass a rule that, you know what, the prison guards, the prison administration, everyone, all the way up to the top brass, we all have to share the same kindergarten. We all have to share the same school. You know there will be pressure. There will be the most positive, the most powerful pressure imaginable to improve conditions at that school, at that kindergarten, right? If the prison guards themselves have to put their own kids in the same classes with the children of the prisoners. And if not, if you decide that, no, we're going to have two separate schools, we're going to have two separate kindergartens, we're going to have separate but equal education systems, you are going to get separate but very unequal education systems, in part because the parents of the children in those two systems of education have very unequal abilities to leverage influence in the government. They have very different abilities to advocate on their own behalf, on behalf of their children. They have very different abilities even to stand up and complain to the teacher. Now, I just say, I have dealt many times in my life with well-intentioned left-of-center people who do not imagine themselves to be racist and who will say that they think it is just fine and dandy for different ethnic groups and different religions to have separate schools, to have separate institutions, to have separate political representation, to have separate political organizations. And they don't realize to what extent they are actually endorsing the politics of segregation. They do not realize to what extent they are recreating the racism that for many years the United States of America was excused under this doctrine of separate but equal. All right? Separate never means equal. The only way we can be equal is by being equal together. The simplest way to have guaranteed that our First Nations people received the same quality of education as the most elite white English-speaking people in the country would have been to send them to the same schools. Anyone who would make excuses for sending out 6-year-olds, again, actually malnourished, actually starving, out to do hard labor at the crack of dawn on this farm or on this orchard, having these kids do all the yard work, having the kids clean the bathrooms. I mean, these seem like small things, but they're not. Right? At the school for white people, the children weren't doing that kind of hard labor, right? At the school for white people, children were being fed by their own parents, not by the teachers, not by the priests and nuns, right? If you just put this in the comparative focus of saying, okay, well, what if it was your child? What if you, as the Prime Minister of Canada, what if you, as a senator in Canada, what if you, as a member of Parliament in Canada, what if your kids actually literally were to attend the same school as First Nations children? Okay. We can't be separate but equal. The only way to be equal is for all of us to endure the consequences of the same political decisions together. And we still don't have this in Canada. In Canada, we have separate schools for the rich and poor. We have separate schools for the English and French, for Anglophones and Francophones. We have separate schools for Catholics. We have separate schools for Italian Catholics and Portuguese Catholics. We have separate schools for Muslims. We have separate schools for Jews. We have separate schools for First Nations people. Which schools do you think are the best schools? Which schools do you think are the worst? By any metric, by any evaluation, right? I was born in 1978. So I was 12 years old, approximately, the year 1990. Going through my teenage years in the 1990s, I knew all this stuff. I knew what had happened to our Native people at the residential schools. I wasn't some brilliant independent researcher. I wasn't publishing a book. You know what I mean? I didn't have connections to the CIA or any secret source information. I knew, right? Everybody knew. Coming back to this imperfect comparison to the Holocaust in Germany, I hinted at two very different routes for the transmission of that knowledge of what was going on, the supposedly secret labor camps, supposedly secret death camps that weren't a secret at all, right? On the one hand, what about the people who actually worked there? Now, the people who worked in Canada's residential schools, they weren't ashamed of themselves. They didn't treat it as a secret. They were proud. We had a really weird controversy with a guy who had been a gym teacher at the residential schools. He taught physical education. And he had gone on to be one of these shady bureaucrats in the Olympic Committee system. So no matter what country you live in the world, you've had some scandals about this, the corruption, and what is this Olympic Committee and how does it work? And who are these people who become administrators and bureaucrats? It's really weird. And there's money involved. Money, fame, power, respect, sometimes sex, right? So this guy had gone from being a gym teacher in the residential schools to being, and, nobody had looked into his background and nobody had looked into what he did. But, the point is, this was openly proclaimed on his resume. This was his, he was proud. He had worked at a school with so many hundred students. He had been the gym teacher. He had been part of it. The number of people employed at these schools And for the vast majority of them, it wasn't a job for life, right? They had another job before, they went on to another job afterward. And they were connected to larger and larger social units through the greatest megaphone that Canadian society had to offer at that time, and still the most powerful unit for social organization in Canadian politics today, the church. I was in Victoria the last time we had elections. When was that? 4 years ago? I don't want to know. We were here almost 4 years ago. I think it was like three and a half years ago. So it's a long time ago now. We were here for elections some time ago. And, I wanted to run. I wanted to stand for office. I went and looked at the paperwork. I needed to be a candidate in the elections. We allegedly have new elections coming up in Canada now. Allegedly, just a few months from now. We don't know yet. It's still uncertain, And let's say I needed 150 signatures. It might have been as little as 70 signatures, but you needed a certain number of signatures, all provided to you by people who live in the same little area of Canada, the same riding, legally speaking. So this is walking distance. Like when we walk a short distance from where we live, west or south, we cross a boundary into a different riding. So you had to know, let's say it was 70 people. You had to know 70 people willing to sign a piece of paper to say, yes, you should be a candidate. You should stand in elections. Let me just say, I have no delusion that I would win if I were to stand in an election. If I were to participate in an election, it would be a platform where I could address some of these political issues we're talking about right now, including First Nations, you name it. There are a lot of political issues I would like to speak on. And if only a few hundred people hear me, that's a worthwhile use of my time. Same comment about this video. A few hundred people will hear and appreciate this video. It's worth my time. It's worth my efforts. My small way of making the world a better place. So I wanted to stand for election. It would have been completely impossible for me with an audience of 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. I forget, 200 supporters on Patreon, something like this. I'm not some huge success. It would have been completely impossible for me to get the signatures I need at that local level from people living within walking distance of myself. Whereas some eccentric religious fundamentalist who will never get 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, who will never get 200 supporters on Patreon, some local wingnut at the church, any church, he can get 70 signatures. He can get 150 signatures and stand for election, right? It's very powerful. The church, still today in 2021, as a unit of social organization, without digressing into this too much, but let's be real. Look at Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a concept. Black Lives Matter is a hashtag. When you look at the people who are actually making a difference in those police brutality cases, case-by-case basis, example by example, almost every single time you find that in reality, there is a local church pastor who started talking about the issue, that like the particular police officer, the particular event, the particular problem, and he started doing fundraising on the issue. And if you can just turn to a congregation of 500 people at your church and say, look, guys, I need everyone to donate $10 so we can pay this lawyer, and probably for the lawyer also, the fame and promotion he gets through your church is significant. Like the lawyer won't do this completely anonymously, but, oh, okay, this church group supports it. I'm going to get on the news. Maybe the lawyer will lower his fees, something for this reason, pro bono. Okay, this church can motivate a lawyer. This church can do a fundraiser and get $5,000 to pay the lawyer. This church can take the issue to the state government, the city government, the police department, right? The church, and specifically in the United States of America, we're here talking about like Black, African-American Protestant churches getting organized. All right. Black Lives Matter is an abstract concept. It's a hashtag. Yes, there's a very small number of Marxists who technically control the organization such as it is, right? But the reality is with most of these cases, the real political activism, the real difference is being made by church groups, okay? So the people who worked in the residential school system, I grew up in the 1990s. I can remember them phoning in to radio talk shows with pride and talking about the work they did in the forcible assimilation of our native people. This stuff wasn't a secret. It wasn't covered up. People didn't think it was an atrocity. Okay? Part of the reason I was able to know about it was that it was so open. Okay? And these people were connected to communities. They were connected to a larger audience, however you want to put it, through the church. The Catholics through the Catholic Church, the Anglicans through the Anglican Church. Many of them, their career was in the church, and just one part of their career was in First Nations education in residential schools. Others had careers as teachers. Okay, public school teachers are very highly paid in Canada. Public school teachers are leaders of political opinion. They're prominent members of their community. People have a captive audience. They talk to parents. They talk to kids. Some of them were career teachers, and they just had a period of their life as teachers in the residential school system. Everybody knew. Everybody knew, partly because this is a small country and a significant percentage of the affluent population, people like teachers, people like leaders of the church choir, shall we say, right, were actually employed in this project directly or indirectly. Right? This is one way. And the other way that people knew, just like I was saying a minute ago about Adolf Hitler writing Mein Kampf, is that the policies themselves were openly and actively proclaimed by the government. Can we stop pretending that this was a secret, right? Like there was propaganda to promote this project. There was recruitment. I mean, for every one person who gets a job like that, there were other people who get interviewed for the job, right? This was a huge coast-to-coast transformative project. The government did plenty of open propaganda about. And another wrinkle, this links to what is referred to in Canada as the 60s scoop. Now, if you don't know the slang, don't worry about it. The 60s scoop, okay? They actually wanted to motivate you, like the average person in the audience, to get involved with forced assimilation by adopting a First Nations child that had been taken away from its parents. Right? This is associated with the decade of the 1960s, but it went on and on. All right. When I was a kid, the Prime Minister of Canada had adopted a First Nations child, forcibly taken away from his family, because they weren't orphans. It's not worth describing those three. It was a form of forced assimilation to separate children from their parents and have them raised by white children. And the Deputy Prime Minister also had a child who was in this way separated from their family. These people, they were directly tainted by, they were directly touched by this experience. And in both of those cases, I don't want to defame these guys, but I followed it, and it was not in the newspapers. The newspapers in Canada are all tightly controlled by the government. You had to go to alternate sources of information like Frank Magazine. There's a cultural reference. And remember Frank Magazine? You had to go to either Frank Magazine or the actual First Nations publications themselves to find out this kind of stuff, because you wouldn't get it in the mainstream press. But, those kids that were adopted by politicians, they had very troubled lives. Let's put it that way. They had criminal charges against them, and then their parents got involved in evading the criminal charges, and they had drug problems and sexual problems. There were scandals attached to those kids that were in Canada completely successfully suffocated the news. But my point is, not only was this not secret, it was something the government at that time was not ashamed of. It was something that was actively propounded and proclaimed as being a positive government policy. And it was a government policy they were trying to motivate you to join in, that you should join in this great effort that united all of white Canada in forcibly assimilating the native people. Okay. And I just want to say, I didn't just know about the government bullshit, right? I knew about the failure of that program to achieve its positive goals. Living in downtown Toronto, have you ever had an Ojibwe person as your dentist? Oh, gee, I've seen Korean dentists. I've seen Chinese dentists. We have dentists from all around the world. We have medical doctors from India and Pakistan. Why do you think we have no medical doctors who are Ojibwe? Why do we have no medical doctors who are Mohawk? Why do you think that is? Talk about nurses or dental hygienists. We have Swedish nurses. We have Russian nurses. We have Filipino nurses. Nurses, some places like Portugal, so on, within Europe. Gee, isn't it funny? Isn't it funny that we just don't have any First Nations people whose education is prepared to take on that role? And let's be clear, a job like that, as humble as it may be to become a nurse, it eliminates poverty in one generation. Okay, you can go, if you think of these things ancestrally, right? You can go from being a poverty-stricken family to being an affluent family in one generation if the transitional generation, either the mother or the father or both, are employed as a nurse. It is simply a highly paying enough job to make that transition out of poverty. That's one of the reasons why it is such an important form of employment for new immigrants. They know if this generation works as a nurse, the next generation is going to have every opportunity imaginable to do whatever they want to do. Not that you're going to be rich, but you will definitely not be poor if you take on the path of being a nurse. In downtown Toronto, I'd had every ethnicity imaginable interact with me over the counter of a bank as a bank teller. Jamaicans. Never once did I have a bank teller who was Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, Dene, First Nations. I knew about the rape. I knew about the murder. I knew about the disappearances in the 1990s. I knew about all this stuff. All right. I knew. My parents before me, if they didn't know, it was a choice. What we're left to deal with in 2021 is the question of why so many people made that choice, including, supposedly well-intentioned left-wing people like my parents. By the way, if you look at my father's formal publications, he published many books. It says all this positive stuff about First Nations people. It's there in print. You can quote him saying kind of anti-racist, pro-First Nation stuff. It's there on paper, but it's paper thin, homie. The whole episode, tells you a lot about what Canadian culture was and what it is. Let me just get the year on the RCAP. It's definitely been more than 20 years. Oh, wow. So there you go. That's perfect for my analysis. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP, I'd forgotten the year. I thought it would have been about 1995. So that got started in 1991. And it finished, but when it finished was less significant than when it started. I'll just say why in a moment. In 1996. Okay, wow. So great. I was just going to say, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP, okay, so this is 1991 to 1996. If you wanted to know about the rapes, if you wanted to know about the murder, if you wanted to know about the torture, if you wanted to know any of those details, that was all set down for you real clearly by the Royal Commission for Aboriginal Peoples. So, how could you not know? How could you not care? Okay, so an interesting question here from Almighty Ohm. So Almighty Ohm says, quote, I may have helped you at your bank. I could not put my proper name on my business card or say I was fluent. Never mind having a grandmother who gave up her status to marry, we had to hide. So this was someone who had some Aboriginal ancestry and some claim to legal status. I'm presuming this is someone who did not grow up actually with Indian status on an Indian status card. That was the term, guys. Sorry, I'm saying Indian wasn't racist. Literally, for the government representative, was called the Indian agent. The Department of Indian Affairs, Indian was the word. So this is someone who didn't have status and someone who in effect, disguised themselves. Well, I knew people with the opposite story too, where they looked First Nations, they looked Aboriginal, they looked Indigenous, and they were treated as Indigenous by the cops. Like they were insulted for being Aboriginal by the cops. But within their own family, there was no story. There was no explanation for this. They didn't know where this came from. And they didn't know themselves if they were the product, like one generation back, of the 1960s scoop, the 60s scoop, this kind of forced adoption program, or what, where it really wasn't clear. So Almighty Om is getting at an interesting question. What about Indigenous people who can pass for white? So I had a friend in Saskatchewan, and her name was Osawaganu. I just mentioned that's how she pronounced it herself. She was not Cree, she was Soto. So there is more than one way to interpret Soto in modern English, put it that way. So her name was Osawaganu. And I was with her when she phoned a taxi company. And so at that time, I don't think this has changed that much, but these days more and more of it is done through an app. She called for a taxi and they asked for her name. They said, can we get your first name for when the taxi arrived? And she didn't use a nickname. She didn't use a whitewash name. She said, Osawaganu. Now, we have a culture here in white English-speaking Canada that's tremendously understanding when people want to use a Chinese name or a Pakistani name or something. But it's remarkable how little patience we have for First Nations, Aboriginal names, Aboriginal ancestry, and so on. So anyway, Almighty Om says that her father was raised in the reserve with no status. She spoke both languages, but she could pass. So yeah. So no, I know there are a lot of people who fall in the cracks this way. And anyway, sorry, it's kind of a different topic. But I mean, one of the questions is how optimistic is anyone about that being the future of First Nations identity? For me, both the optimism and the pessimism ultimately are linked to language. I just don't see DNA as being the focus of what in the 21st century. What in the 21st century does First Nation status mean, or status in any sense? I think it has to revolve around the language as the touchstone of identity. I knew a white guy, and he was very white. He was like white skin with red hair. Just mentioned it was very obvious he was I don't know if he was of Scottish ancestry or what, but he grew up entirely on a First Nations reservation. And his father, I'm sorry, distant memory, his father was something like the electrician for the First Nations. It was something like that. Like his father had a job on the reservation of that kind. I would guess electrician and handyman repairing things. So he was a white kid who grew up entirely on a First Nations reservation. All of his friends growing up were First Nations. And then he lived, in between two worlds. But, he spoke no language but English, right? So, that's where you're from. But obviously it would be very different if that guy had grown up and he was fluent in Cree or he was fluent in Ojibwe or anything else. It would have a different impact for him, different impact for the future of the country. All right. So I was just going to say the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. This is the grand Canadian tradition of having a so-called fact-finding mission and an inquiry, and it making absolutely no difference whatsoever, and it sinking down to being the level of a footnote, known only by academics. But the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, it concluded with a list of recommendations. Let's say it was 120 recommendations, maybe it was 200 recommendations. But there was sort of the final conclusion was this list of things they were supposed to do. So I was still a kid in 1996. But nevertheless, my response to that, I remember reading the list and I was furious because I felt like this wasn't going to change anything at all. I thought this is too namby-pamby. This is too conciliatory. Like we need fundamental change for the status of First Nations in Canada. 20 years later, you look back at that list. None of it happened. None of the recommendations were followed. Nothing happened. Of course, I assumed naively in 96, these recommendations, this is what the government was now going to take as their plan of action to transform the status of First Nations people in Canada. Nope. Nothing happened, nothing changed. And now you look back on it, you think about what a better world it might be today if in 1996 the government had taken that kind of positive action. All right, so there's some more stuff that would be interesting to respond to. Everyone knew, nobody did anything about it. Why? I think that most people, left or right, dabble in politics, wanting to feel powerful, wanting to feel important, and being afraid of or avoiding a sense of powerlessness, a sense of impotence, a sense of their own insignificance in the world. My parents climbed over the fence in Ottawa at the Parliament building to tear down the American flag and burn it in front of the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of the United States, who were behind the window looking out at them as they did this. It was a rare occasion where the President of the United States was visiting Canada. Obviously, they could have gone to jail or been beaten up by the cops. My father subscribed to the theory that the cops had been told to stand back and let it happen. That it was politically convenient for the Prime Minister of Canada to say, look, you can see how much the people here are against you. Perhaps to say, look, this is why Canada can't do more to help you in Vietnam or whatever it was. Interesting theory on my father's part. All right. My parents were people who felt powerful, who felt important, taking a stand on Vietnam. This is this great phrase we have in English, taking a stand. What does it mean, take a stand? It's ridiculous. Taking a stand on Laos, taking a stand on Cambodia. Parts of the world, places they were perfectly ignorant of. They were absolutely ignorant of those places. And I think, of course, strategically and morally, what they had to say about those places was completely wrong. Right? But it made them feel powerful. It made them feel important. So the problem is weakness perceived as strength, strength perceived as weakness, right? Because my parents and millions of people in their generation would have felt weak, would have felt embarrassed, would have felt out of place, getting in their cars and driving to a First Nations reservation and saying, hey, I understand you guys are going through this terrible transition year. I understand there's this crisis. I understand this problem, and I want to help. And maybe I'm not sure how I can help. I want to get involved. And maybe you don't just drive your car there once. Maybe you go back again and again. And maybe it's difficult, and maybe it's awkward. And maybe those people speak English with difficulty, with a certain accent you find very difficult to decipher at first. And maybe a lot of them are alcoholics. And maybe a lot of them are overweight. And maybe they don't wear fashionable clothes the way people do in Toronto or Montreal, right? Like, this is the shallowness people have in politics. I remember reading a comment on the internet. This was one of the many times at which I considered becoming a lawyer. And I was looking around for advice about going to law school, specific things I was Googling about going to law school. And I found this comment from a guy saying, young people today have an idea of being a lawyer and an activist that comes from the TV show Ally McBeal. There's a cultural reference. I hope it's been forgotten. I hope nobody remembers the TV show. And he said, it's shallow, but it's really true. They assume they are going to live a life surrounded by beautiful, well-dressed, fashionable people having witty dialogue and, sitting down in boardroom meetings and coming to sudden decisive decisions about issues of great importance, moral, legal, and political issues. And this is not what working in the law is like at all, right? I think that, and look, I'll speak about my own father. My father grew up with photographs in Time magazine, photographs in Life magazine, photographs in the newspaper. We've all seen him. Always a beautiful young woman, painted with flowers and either naked or in a bikini at a peace protest. Whether it was a peace protest or a concert, right? There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that my father got involved with radical politics because of the good-looking women that were on the cover of the newspaper. And if you go to those protests, there are enough good-looking women. If you go to a protest in downtown Montreal or downtown Toronto or Ottawa, I mean, you guys know this. People go to vegan protests for that reason. Obviously, if you're a heterosexual woman, you could go to meet good-looking men. If you're a gay man, you could go to meet good-looking gay men. And you are going with these kinds of Ally McBeal assumptions. You're going with the assumption that you're going to meet witty, highly educated, well-spoken, sharp, fashionably dressed, like-minded people. And you may not admit to yourself that these are the incredibly shallow reasons for your own political activism. And you may not realize that, you went to a fundraiser for Stop the War in Vietnam or Stop the War in Cambodia, right? This is my parents, when those wars were on. And wow, there were all these well-dressed, attractive people. This is just what I was looking for. And maybe they let you get up on stage and speak for a moment. And now you feel powerful. And now you feel influential. And now you feel important. You're perceiving weakness as strength. The reality is you're not saving a single human life. Right? This is like the lead singer of the Beatles doing his sleep-in protest. John Lennon. Sorry, I'm not a Beatles fan. You can tell. John Lennon claiming he was saving lives by staying in bed in a hotel in Canada. I believe it was in Montreal, and giving interviews. This kind of totally passive, totally counterproductive, protest. And you know what? There was this other cause. There was this other difference you could have made. You could have gone to the residential schools. You could have asked yourself, would I put my kid in this residential school? You could have asked yourself, who hired these teachers? Who evaluated them? What qualifications do these people have? Well, guess what? In Canada, we don't have separation of church and state. The United States has that principle in their constitution, right? In Canada, we don't have separation of church and state. We have the church and state working together hand in glove. We have the state handing out contracts to the church, right? And we have the state paying for and installing stained glass windows in church buildings on First Nations reservations, shamelessly, right? Again, that's an issue my parents could have made a difference in, not overnight, not instantly. They could have become lifelong, decade by decade crusaders saying, hey, look, there's something fundamentally immoral and evil and wrong here about having separate schools for Catholics and Protestants, about having separate schools for different ethnic groups, having separate schools for rich and the poor, separate schools for First Nations and Europeans, right? And there's something profoundly evil about the government of Canada treating the Catholic Church as its contractor, and the government of Canada giving up its legal responsibility to evaluate the competence of the credentials of the teachers and put them in that position. I just mentioned, I did read some of the actual court rulings under this heading. And I remember one of them, the judge had to make a decision about to what extent the church was responsible as opposed to the Canadian government on exactly this issue, residential schools, forced assimilation. And it was a specific area of misconduct therein, And the judge said, look, like 99% of the evil, 99% of the harm was done by the church here. But nevertheless, right. Sorry. And the other side of it is the church had presented all their evidence for their case to, disclaimer responsibility, and documents and record of the Hansard being examined. And on the other hand, the government of Canada, it's not just that the government of Canada didn't do these evil things with its own hands or its own staff or by giving its own direct orders, but obviously the record shows they gave it almost no thought at all. They just didn't really care. They didn't think about it. Like, okay, church will do it. No more debate, no more invigilation, no quality control. You know what I mean? No. But the judge said, fundamentally, it doesn't matter if the church is 99% responsible and the government only played a 1% role here, because theoretically, the responsibility rested with the government. Like the moral onus, the order was ultimately given by the government, the higher power, the higher responsibilities for the government. And I forget if he made it a 60-40 split or a 49%, 51% split, but he gave the larger part of responsibility to the government. It's like, look, even if you didn't do this, it was your responsibility to do it. It was your responsibility to prevent it happening. It was your responsibility to scrutinize, to evaluate, to invigilate this process that was happening. And the fact that you didn't do it ultimately doesn't lower your culpability. All right. Everybody knew there was a difference that could have been made. And on a mass scale, right? On a massive scale, there was total indifference and total inaction. While simultaneously, there was so much activism, there was so much passion on these other issues that came and went, making no difference in the world. My own family was torn apart by the Israel-Palestine conflict. The Green Party of Canada was torn apart by the Israel-Palestine conflict. The New Democrat Party of Canada, the NDP, our mainstream left of center party, has been torn apart and still is being torn apart by the Israel-Palestine conflict. Everyone wants to take a stand. Everyone wants to take a stand on the Gaza Strip. What difference can you possibly make? And what difference would it or could it possibly make for you to practice your sense of moral superiority coming in here? And when I say coming in here, literally at the dinner table at my family, right? At that scale, or coming in here at a party meeting for the Green Party or the NDP, or at City Hall in Toronto or in Ottawa. Like, what difference can it make for you to take a stand? Do you think the fate of Israel or the fate of Palestine rests in the hand of the Canadian government? And do you think it's going to make any difference for you to cuss out your own grandmother or something, your own aunts and uncles fighting over this? It's weakness perceived as strength, and it's strength perceived as weakness. You could have made a difference. You could have made a difference on the separation of church and state. And you know what? It's the same fundamental evil in Israel as it is in Canada. The fundamental problem Israel has is that they had to make a decision between being a democracy and being a theocracy. And they didn't decide. Their government is a mix of the two. Right? I mean, now, Saudi Arabia, theocracy, no democracy at all, right? Israel has a hybrid system, right? But the separation of church and state is a fundamental problem in Israel, just as it is in Canada, right? And the most extreme, the most obvious victims are Aboriginal people, right? And you know what the thing is about real problems where you can really make a difference? I attended political events related to this, including back in the 1990s. Would have been 1997, 1998, like not when I was a little kid kind of thing. But I remember I went to political events related to First Nations people. And one of them that I attended, somebody much older than me stood up and told a story. By the way, if you get to know First Nations people, there is a culture of telling stories. So this is another thing. If you actually go to these events, there is a culture, unlike white English-speaking events, where an elderly person will stand up and talk for like 20, 30 minutes, and everyone listens continuously, It's very different from the style of discourse. There is a storytelling culture. And often, I also have funny stories about often the sort of village elder figure, anyone, could be anyone, someone who's of the kind of grandparent you heard. Sometimes they'll tell like a 20-minute story just for a plot twist at the very end that relates to the political issue. just like that's part of they have their own sense of humor, they have their own style of storytelling. But anyway, I was at one of these meetings. Someone stood up and told the story, and they said, we had a meeting. I forget which facet of the First Nations residential school crisis this was addressed. This, but we had a meeting, and there was this white guy there, and he said that he had come to the conclusion that the solution was for white people to convert to the indigenous religion of the native people. That they have to stop being Christian, they have to embrace, Aboriginal religion, and that he said he was going to lead by example. He wanted to do this himself, and he kind of caused a scene because he was saying he was a white person. He wasn't from that region or something. He wasn't living out near a reservation, and he was saying, "No, you have to do it. Like the village elders, you have to arrange for me to convert to your religion." And you can imagine the kind of anxiety and confusion and consternation. Ultimately, an old woman at that meeting, again, it was described to me, heard the story at a different meeting, I wasn't there myself, but what was described was that this older woman said to the guy ultimately to shut him up, "Look, it doesn't work that way. If you want to join our religion, you have to come and live with our community. You actually have to come out and live with us. That's the only way to do it. Like you have to move and you have to spend serious amounts of time attending our events. Like you can't just sign up. You can't just get a tattoo." Plenty of people do get a tattoo. All right. It's a totally false dichotomy to look at this situation and say Christianity is evil, whereas the indigenous religion is good. And I've studied the indigenous religion. Almost no white people in Canada have. All right. If the indigenous religion had continued uninterrupted, we would all be able to tell you terrible, horrifying things about that religion and what it does to people. Right? That's not the choice we're facing in the year 2021. Right? The status today of that religion, having been destroyed, having been given up by the native people. Right? In some cases, it was taken from them against their will, but in many cases, when you start going through the history, many of the tribes, the vast majority of people, willingly and eagerly converted to Christianity. Another side of the history that's very uncomfortable to talk about. A lot of them were enthusiastic converts. A lot of them became preachers themselves and went to the tribe next door and tried to convert that tribe to Christianity. For a lot of them, the gospel was a huge turning point in their religion, right? A huge turning point in the history of their culture that they really embraced. And tragically, they embraced a form of cultural change that destroyed them. All right. The status of that religion today amongst First Nations is something like the status of the poetry of Shakespeare amongst speakers of the English language. Okay. There is literature, there are stories, okay, but there is no human sacrifice anymore. There is no slavery anymore. There's no torture. There's no, the warrior culture has disappeared. People are not fighting to the death in order to be given a feather that would symbolize their bravery. So it's gone. It's over. They gave up their religion in part, and in part, forcibly, it was taken from them. What I have to say to Christians is, you're next. What you demanded of them, we now have to demand of ourselves. If you think about what was accomplished, quote unquote, positively by the residential schools, right? It was the secularization of First Nations people. It was a totally failed attempt to prepare them for life in the modern world. And nobody among the white English-speaking or white French-speaking people ever looked in the mirror and thought, oh, maybe this would be good for me. Maybe this would be good for my children. Maybe we also should go through a process of confronting the feudal and ancient past, the vestiges of it that continue in modern life, through the organized conspiracy of the Christian church, right? Gee, circumcision. This makes a lot of sense. So we cut off part of our penis to perpetuate a ritual that was written down and described in the Old Testament for the sons of Abraham, so that we'll bear the mark of the covenant between the Jewish people and God on our loins. This makes a lot of sense. There's nothing barbaric about this. This isn't a vestige. No. Have a religion based on worshiping a man who was tortured and executed by the state. Look at the poll numbers. Christians are pro-capital punishment. Christians are pro-torture. Whereas atheists in both the United States of America and Canada are morally opposed to capital punishment and are morally opposed to torture. And these people, Christians, walk around with a symbol of capital punishment, a symbol of state-sanctioned execution hanging around their necks. All right. Why was I so horrified back in the years 1991 to 1996 by the recommendations of the Royal Commission for Aboriginal Peoples, the RCAP? Right? I'd say in a phrase, because there was neither anything creative nor anything destructive about it. In reality, we need to create a new culture, and we need to demolish the old. We need to create a new culture, and we need to demolish the old. It seems to me inexorable and inevitable. That the conclusion we should draw from our history of attempted genocide against the Aboriginal people is not just about the separation of church and state, but the abolition of the Christian religion itself. And you will look in vain for any suggestion that this might happen in the conclusions of the report of the Royal Commission for Aboriginal People. You will look in vain for any such suggestion in the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I am not interested in truth in this sense, because everyone already knew the truth in the 1990s. It wasn't a secret. Everyone knew. The only people who didn't know were those who chose to disregard the facts that were already available at that time. And I am not interested in reconciliation. I'm interested in change.